So I'm the community projects manager here. So I oversee our garden program, and then I run our orchard program. So a couple housekeeping things. Everybody is automatically muted, so you can't speak, unfortunately. And that's just so we don't have lots of background noise and whatnot. But we want to hear from you, especially if you have questions. And so the best way to do that is if you put your questions or comments into the Q&A section, which you can usually get from the little drop down. And then throughout the talk, Megan, the other person that you can see here, will be answering those questions as best she can. If there's a question that she can't answer, she will save that question and she will read it to me aloud at the end, and I will answer it then for the group. So, so again, if you just have any questions or comments, please put those there. Otherwise, we will get going. So first, I want to say that this is an incredibly broad topic. And so hopefully you're going to get what you're hoping to get from it. I'm going to try and touch on a lot of different things. And we are going to be focusing, just because of who we are, primarily on food. So we're not really going to be talking about, you know, how to landscape with ornamentals specifically, although we're going to talk about techniques that are translatable to that. There we go. So first, I always like to go into to break some ideas first. Got to start from scratch. And so first, kind of the idea of why separate our plants. So a lot of times when we're thinking about our gardens or our yards, a lot of times the thought is like, oh, these are like the ornamentals, and here's my vegetable garden, and here's my fruit trees, and they tend to be very separate. And there's not theoretically any reason to do that. There are specific situations where it makes sense to separate them, which we'll talk about, but you don't really have to most of the time. And sometimes these different plants grow great together and can even encourage each other. And there are places in the world where that's the norm. And there's agricultural practices where you grow multiple things together, and they actually find that you get more you know, food per square foot per acre than you would if you grew them separate. And this is just a very broad scale idea that this is actually a young apple orchard. These are all apple trees here with the little stakes, and then between is wheat growing over the winter. So like, you know, you don't have to separate things. The wheat and these apples grow just fine. And a lot of times it's the case that, you know, if you plant a flower next to your vegetable plant, they're both going to grow just fine. And to be more specific, you can also, or I guess I already kind of said this, but there's also no reason to segregate your edibles from your non-edibles. So you can mix your vegetables and your fruits, but you can also mix your, you know, your edibles, your fruits and your vegetables with your flowers, with your non-edibles. And really kind of the distinction a lot of times, and one of the easy ways to kind of see how the way that we separate plants is a little arbitrary, is that there's quite a few plants that, you know, if you look at it, it's like, is that an edible or is that an ornamental? It kind of depends on who you are. There's lots of edibles that a lot of people think are really pretty. Things like nasturtiums, or like, you know, crinkly kale or multicolored, you know, lettuces, things like that, that are all really pretty. A lot of fruit trees have beautiful blooms in the spring. And there are more than a few plants that in the United States we consider ornamentals that are not only edible, but are actually food crops in other parts of the world. Things like daylilies are grown as commercial food crops in parts of East Asia. Cannas were originally domesticated as a starch crop and are still commercially grown in parts of Southeast Asia for starch. And so a lot of times those distinctions are murky at best. And so a lot of times you can just grow them together. And this is just a picture of you know, what it can kind of look like. So it's kind of the idea of like edible landscaping, you know, which is not just landscaping with edibles, but doing both. You know, you don't need to separate them. You don't need to have your, you know, raised bed square boxes with your vegetables and then your, you know, landscaping up against your house. You can mix them together, mix and match. And this picture here is of, you know, a little backyard area. And there's things that are not edible, you know, like this like kind of pine coniferous thing here, you know, I don't think they grew that for food. And there's things like cone flowers, which, you know, can be used medicinally, but aren't like a vegetable or anything. But in amongst them, there's things like a little serviceberry bush and some Swiss chard growing, and rose bushes, which are actually edible, believe it or not. And there's some beans growing up along the fence on a trellis. And there's some, you know, there's a tomato plant here with some carrots and turnips. And if you look at it, it just looks like landscape. It just looks like pretty backyard. So you can mix those together, which is a good place to start, in my opinion, if you're trying to think of like, how do I design these things? Is think that you don't need to stick to the boxes that you are used to or that you see other people doing. So why mix them together? I've talked about this a little bit, but one, I mean, it can be prettier, and I mean, depending on your aesthetic, but like, I think this is really pretty. I don't think, you know, having this and then a couple like raised bed boxes that half the year are just empty dirt, I don't think that's as pretty. Whereas, you know, if your vegetables here are gone, there's still lots of other things, there's lots of other interest. So I think it can be prettier. You can have fewer pests, you know, if your vegetables are kind of spread out, and there's a lot more kind of diversity. If there's, you know, a pine tree between your two chard plants versus, you know, the two chard plants just hanging out next to each other, it's going to make your pest's life harder. So there tends to be fewer pests. The more kind of diversity you have, the more you mix things together. You can also increase your space, in a manner of speaking, in the sense of, you know, if you want to grow food, and you think, well, you know, all I've got is these like 3 raised beds, then, you know, even if you grow the most, you know, high yielding crop in the world, you've still only got those 3 raised beds in your whole yard where you're growing food. Whereas if you think about it of like, oh, all this space that I also have, you know, trees and flowers and things like that, I can also be growing food in amongst them, or even the trees and the flowers I'm growing can be edible themselves. You're then increasing the amount of space in your yard that's actually producing food. And that can actually increase your yields in not only because you're giving it more space, but it also means that because you have more space, you don't need to be growing crops that are as productive. You can be growing some more like interesting things that maybe don't yield as high, but because, you know, something is better than nothing. You know, so if you're growing an apple tree instead of a you know, Japanese maple tree, that Japanese maple is producing nothing. So if you're producing an apple tree, even if it only produces 3 apples, that's still infinitely more food than the Japanese maple was giving you. It's also a way to get around some anachronistic rules. You know, if there's rules in your municipality about having edible, you know, vegetable gardens, a lot of times the way that people see that is by, you know, that like, oh, that's a raised bed, that's vegetables. Whereas if it's mixed in and it's really pretty and people can't even tell that it's food, they don't know. And the whole idea of like the lawn too, like, I mean, if you take up your lawn, do more edible landscaping, was originally developed really as a status symbol. It was a way of showing, look at me, I have so much money. I can pay people to maintain this thing that is completely worthless, that produces nothing of value for me, which, you know, until relatively recently, people couldn't do unless you were really rich, because before the lawnmower, it was a lot of work to keep a lawn going. A couple caveats, though, that I always like to bring up whenever we're thinking about kind of edible landscaping or planning, especially where we're at in St. Louis. If you're in the city, or especially the city or some of the older suburbs in particular, we can have issues with soil contamination. There's elevated levels of lead almost everywhere in St. Louis City, and pretty commonly in a lot of the older suburbs. I mean, it might be in other places too, but it's good to know if your soil is contaminated. A lot of times you can tell just by looking at what was there before. You know, if you're in an area where it's like, oh, it was a farm field and then they built this house here, you probably don't have elevated levels of lead. But if there was, you know, multiple buildings there before, or, you know, or it's been a house for a really, like a really long time, whenever there used to be lots of lead paint and everything, it's not a bad idea to get a soil test if you're going to want to be growing food in amongst your landscaping. But if you do then test it and you find out that there are elevated levels or some other contamination, that's something that if you're wanting to grow food, you're going to want to keep in mind, and make sure that that your edibles are being grown in safe soil. So a lot of times that's where raised beds come in. It's one of the reasons why they're so common in St. Louis, is because you're bringing in nice fresh soil that's not contaminated that you're putting in the beds. And that's usually enough to keep vegetables safe, because the lead levels here for the most part are not really high. They're just a little bit higher than normal. And so usually just having that fresh soil is enough that you're safe. But it means that you do want to have that fresh soil. So you might either want a raised bed or be hauling in fresh soil on top if you're wanting to do larger areas in ground. And it's also important to know that, again, especially if we were just talking about slightly elevated levels, generally fruit is not a concern. Lead levels need to be much higher in the soil before safety is an issue with fruit, versus if you're growing lettuce or root crops of some kind, the levels don't need to be as high for it to be an issue. And Missouri Extension has lots of great information about that if you have concerns about soil contamination on your site. Pets are another thing to keep in mind. If you're thinking, oh, I'm going to scatter my plants, like my lettuce plants, like all over the place because they're pretty, which can work really great. But if you have, a dog or a cat or some other pet that likes to go to the bathroom outside, and they're going to the bathroom all over in your landscaping, probably not the best idea to be growing lettuce in there, because that's how you get E. coli. You don't want them to be peeing on any of your food crops, and so if they kind of go all over the place, then you want to be aware of that and pick your plants accordingly. It's also important to know, I'm just going to crush some dreams right here, that there are certain plants that generally do not work well, at least without some serious homework and potential major soil changes going on. And these are plants that like really acidic soils. So again, especially if you're in the city, the pH of the soil here is generally pretty high, usually 7 or even higher. 7 to 7.5 is not uncommon. And blueberries and cranberries, lingonberries, wintergreen, all of these on this list here really want a pH of about 4.5 to 5.5. And that's a big difference. And the thing that makes it even harder is the city water supply in the city has a pH of about 9. So if you're watering from a hose, you have a plant that wants a pH of 4.5 to 5.5, and you're sticking it in something that has a pH of 7, and then you're watering it with something with a pH of 9. Generally, they just don't like that. So you can do things like there's soil acidifiers that you can add to your soil. The people that I have seen that have been the most successful is where they've like literally dug out the soil, like dug a huge hole and then filled it with like peat moss, and then set up a rain barrel system to catch rainwater so that the pH was right, and then only watered it with that. And then they got pretty good blueberries. But that's a lot of work. And so if you don't want to do that work, probably don't plant those things. There's lots of other things that you can plant. And a lot of times what they're going to look like is something like this. You're going to get lots of discoloration on the leaves. They probably won't die, but they're not going to grow very much, or they're going to grow really slowly. And you're going to see a lot of this like leaf discoloration, which is from nutrient deficiencies because the pH is not right for the plant. So, so there's just a couple things to keep in mind, kind of big ones. Like if you're looking around and you're thinking, oh, I'll buy this blueberry. Probably don't, unless you want to do that upfront work. So when we're actually thinking about designing the space, I've got a couple slides here where we're going to talk about kind of preparing for that, because that's important, because you don't want to just start throwing things in willy-nilly. You can do it that way, but it starts to get tricky over time as you try and get more and more in there. It's good to sit down and really kind of make a master plan of some kind, to at least think it out. And the best way to do that is to, in my opinion, is to make a map of the space. So the whole property that you're looking at doing, front yard, backyard, side yards, house, everything, your whole lot. And you want to put things on there, and you can get some already You can like take a Google Maps, like a satellite image, can be a good way to start if you want, or if you want to just draw it out, that also works. And on this map, you want to put the first things are kind of like what I said, call like the bones, like the things that aren't going anywhere, kind of like the major kind of structures of the property. So things like your house, you're probably not going to be bulldozing your house. Driveway, sidewalks, outbuildings, like if you have a shed or a detached garage or something like that, a fence, any of those like permanent structures that, are probably going to be there for the long haul, probably not going anywhere. And this would also include any established trees or plants that you already have or that you have no interest in removing. So, if you've got, a 100-year-old oak tree that you love, put that on there, because all of these things, and including like trees and stuff, are all going to help determine what you can and can't grow in your space. So put them on there. And also that includes utilities. So if you've got a power line that drapes across your yard to get to your house, put that on the map, because that means where that power line is, you can't be putting a giant tree. And it helps you kind of see that, so you can figure out where you can put big trees if you want. And that also can include below ground utilities. If you're wanting to dig big holes to be planting trees in, probably want to know where your utilities are. So call and get your utilities marked, so you don't end up cutting a power line or something weird as you're trying to plant your beautiful new fruit or nut tree. And this is just an example. It doesn't have to be real fancy, but just getting it down on paper. Or like I said, you can pull up like a satellite image, which can also be helpful. If nothing else, to use as something to trace. You can kind of get that satellite image, and then you can get a drawing that's kind of to scale that you can trace. By like sticking up the satellite image on a window and then taping a piece of paper over it, and the light shining through, you can draw out kind of the border of your property. You can kind of see where the house is, where the driveway is, and then you've got like a nice to scale thing that you can use. And then it's important to think about any more like bones or like permanent structures that you are wanting to add in the future. So, if you're looking at your property and you're like, oh, it's all grass now and I walk all over the place, but you want to be planting, things everywhere, you need to be thinking about like some serious logistics in terms of like, well, I'm probably not going to tear up literally every square inch and do it, because then I can't, walk to my garage that's on the back of my property or something. So, you want to think about like, where are you going to walk? Are you going to have walking paths? Do you want to have seating areas that you're going to be using to like go and sit and enjoy your yard? Do you want things like pergolas or arbors or, lawn areas? Lawns are nice. People like, lawns. People like to play games. Kids like to run around. And so like, is there an area of lawn that you want to make sure to keep? That's, maybe your best grass, or, is close to the house, which you like because you like to go, I don't know, walk around in the grass, with your bare feet or something. Or, that's the area where the dog goes to the bathroom. Kind of mark those areas, because those are all going to determine areas that are then not for planting. And you want to know that, so that you don't, tear up everything and then realize, oh, the dog doesn't have somewhere to go to the bathroom. So mark all of those things. And then any planting beds that you already have, or once you've marked all these things, you then have an idea kind of what planting areas you might have, or what areas are potentially open to planting. But you don't want to forget about access to those beds. So for example, here, if you look at this map, there's this big old chunk right here that's like, oh, this is all a planting bed. And if you think like, oh, I'm just going to plant solid all the way across it. Well, what happens when you need to weed back here? Or if this is a nut tree, how are you going to pick up the nuts? So maybe think about like, oh, I want to make sure that there's paths, path that goes around the tree or something. So just, think about getting around. Because if you think, oh, I don't want to waste space for walking paths, and you plant it all, but then you have to trample half of it because there's no walking paths, you're not actually getting any more food, or any more flowers, or, whatever you got. So then kind of the final things that you're going to add to your map is, once you kind of put all those, bones, those permanent features in place, thought about where, your future walking paths might be, is you want to look at, then especially those areas that are left that are potentially planting areas, and you want to be marking things that are important for plants. So you want to mark things like soil conditions. So that includes things like areas that pool water. If you've got an area that, every time we have one of our massive thunderstorms, it becomes swampy or it pools water for, a couple hours or a day or more, you definitely want to mark that on your map. Because, if it's an area that's going to be wet like that, that's going to mean that there's certain plants that you really do not want to plant there. And it will steer you towards plants that will tolerate that. So you want to mark that. If you have areas that are really rocky, same thing. There's some things that they're not going to enjoy rocky areas at all, but there's other things that really do. And so that kind of, marking those on there can help tell you, oh, like this is a good spot for this. And then you can kind of plan around that. And that includes things like, are there areas that are or gravel? If somebody used to have like a gravel parking space and it's like grown over in grass now, well, you want to know if it's still gravelly there, because that's going to help determine, if it's really gravelly, you probably don't want to be trying to dig through there and planting like vegetables, because that's going to be a lot of work versus, digging one big hole to plant a tree, maybe not as much work. But that also includes things like compaction. If someone was parking there, like if that's why it's rocky, it's probably really compacted. And that can also help determine kind of what to plant there. So just looking at your soil and thinking about those kinds of things. Are there really wet areas? Are there really dry areas? Are there areas that are like really compacted because, people used to park there, or there used to be a shed there, or there used to be a building there, or things like that. And just put them on your map. Just mark them, just so you know when you're looking at your map. And you also want to do things like topography. Most people's yards, unless you have a really big yard, don't have a huge amount of topography to them. But if you've got a part of your yard that has a pretty steep slope to it, or is uneven, has got like lots of holes or something like that, mark those on your map. Because again, if you've got an area that's like really sloped, you're probably not going to want to do vegetables there, where you're going to have to be working up the soil, and there's going to be bare soil on a regular basis, because you're going to have a lot of erosion. Versus slopes can be great places to do trees. Trees don't mind slopes at all. And so just putting those on there can help kind of guide your planning process to give you somewhere to start. And then the last one, which can also be really critical, is shade. You want to also mark where shade is in your yard. So if you've got, your house, and, the area to the north of your house is probably going to be shaded a lot of the time, or, most to almost all of the time. And so, spend some time out in your yard. It's a good excuse to go hang out outside and see, in the mornings, see in the evening, notice over the year, because it'll change a little bit, what areas are shaded and when are they shaded, if you have an area where it's like, oh, it's shaded in the morning, but it's only shaded for 2 hours and then it's full sun the rest of the day, that's different than an area like this in this picture, where it's like right under this tree. This area right under the tree is shaded a lot of the time, at least half the time, although it might move, versus like the area, just to the immediate north of your house is probably shaded, like I said, like 90+% of the time. And so, mark those on there and have like a general idea of kind of when it's shade, like kind of how much shade, are we talking like an hour? Are we talking every minute? And that can, again, guide what will fit into those spaces. And for the most part, when we're talking about shade, you want at least like 6 to 8 hours of sun for vegetables and really most fruit production. So that, again, that can help kind of guide, what you fit where. So like I would never be trying to grow tomatoes under this tree, because you're probably not going to get many tomatoes. But, I grow tomatoes, over here where it's relatively flat and nice and sunny. But there are some things that you could grow in a shady area. There's some herbs that'll grow there. There's some fruiting things like currants that'll grow under there, and we'll kind of go through those lists. But, again, it just helps guide what your options are. And so once you kind of, mark all those things, that's kind of your base map. So that's, the map that will determine what areas you have to work with for planting, and kind of what conditions you have in those planting areas. Like I said, whether they're shaded, whether they're compacted, whether they're, pooling water when it's wet or when it's raining. And then once you have your map, This is when you get the part where you dream big. So this is where you want to make a list of kind of all the plants that you are excited about growing. Food, fruit, vegetables, nuts, flowers, native ornamentals, whatever it is, whatever plants you're excited about growing, make that list and, dream big. I probably don't put a banana on there, but if you really want to do bananas, you can do bananas here. But make that list of all the things that you're most excited about and then kind of prioritize them. So think about, oh, I've got, if you've got 15 fruit trees on your list that you're, excited about, but you've only got space, but you've got a really small, city lot to work with, you're probably not going to get all 15 on there. So, kind of get at least a rough priority of well, I'm excited about all these 15, but really these 3 or 4 are the ones that I really want to make sure that I get. Then, then do that. Those are your top priority. So kind of prioritize that and try and get a good range of, trees, shrubs, vegetables, kind of get all of them. If you're looking to kind of, landscape, grow food and whatnot across your whole yard. And that's when you would start placing them on your map. You start looking at them and thinking about, so I put this little note here. You also want to know if it needs a pollinator or not. So things like, apple trees, you need at least 2 apple trees to get fruit. Whereas a peach tree, you only need 1 peach tree. So knowing that can really help you also figure out, if you have enough space for something, or, if your top, 10 list has 5 that need a pollinator and 5 that don't need a pollinator, and you only have space for 5 trees, then the 5 self-pollinating ones are probably going to be the ones that you want to do. And so, you look at that, got your list, prioritize them, figure out if they need the pollinator, and then start placing them on your map. And when you're placing them on your map, you really want to plan from the top down. So you don't want to be looking and thinking, oh, I really want to grow, tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and strawberries and blackberries and, things that stay shorter. And then, plan out the entire space with all of those and then be and I'm going to throw a chestnut tree right here. Well, that chestnut tree is going to cast shade and then you're not going to be able to grow those things there. So plan from the top down, plan those big things that are going to cast shade, because that shade is going to determine what you can and cannot grow underneath it in the space. So, plan from that top down. So start with your big trees first, and then move to your kind of smaller trees, and then move to your shrubs, and then move to your, ground covers and perennials and annual vegetables and things like that. Kind of move, from the top down. And you want to plan for mature size. That's really important. So, I've seen places where I'll go to a garden and they'll be like, oh, we planted a pecan tree. And I was like, oh, great, where is it? And they're like, it's right here, a foot away from my shed. It's oh, pecan trees get 70 feet wide. How's that gonna work? So you really want to think about kind of the mature size that you're gonna get. And knowing that you can always plant short-term stuff until the plant gets to its mature size. So, that pecan tree, it can get 70 feet wide, but it could take 50, 100 years to get that big. There's no reason that you can't do smaller shrubs, annual vegetables, perennial vegetables, around that tree while it's growing. And that picture that I showed, kind of the first picture that I showed, is what that farmer was doing. While his trees were still small, he was growing annual grains in between it. There's no reason that you can't do that same thing in your yard. And this is just an example, and this is more of an aesthetic issue, but you can see where somebody planted, this, I'm not sure what kind of conifer that is. If that's a fir or spruce or something. Don't know my conifers well, but some sort of coniferous tree here. And then they planted this other tree here, and they planted them, you can see, a little too close together, because as they grew, this conifer's got this weird, little jog to it there. It doesn't have that nice cone shape because they were too close together. This tree grew faster, shaded it, pushed it over to the side. And so, making sure that you've got enough space is going to make those trees have that nice, beautiful shape for you. And on the smaller scale too, if you smash 2 tomato plants real close together, it's just going to be a tangled mess. And you're really not going to get much more food than if you just planted them spaced out so that they had enough space for themselves. So then when you're thinking about this, you're planning from your top down, like layer your plants. So, kind of like we've talked about a little bit, integrate, don't segregate the different types of plants. And that'll also give you a more natural look. It'll give a more kind of organic feel to your yard and your garden and your orchard. And mix your annuals in with your perennials. And I think that, this is a huge thing too, to also make the area look prettier all year round. And again, the vegetable garden is kind of the perfect example of that. If you have, your annual vegetable garden and it's separate from everything else, that area generally looks pretty sad, from, October, November until usually April or so. Until the plants really start get growing. And that's a big chunk of time. Whereas, if you have a layout like this picture, where you've got, these kind of established perennial ornamentals, really, you could have, like in this kind of mulched area here, you could grow some chard or some lettuce or stuff like that, which would add to the beauty during the growing season. But in the fall and the winter, when their lettuce and stuff isn't there, you still have these there. It's not just a dead, empty space. And you can see this area is actually mixed together. I don't know if you noticed it, but this area here is strawberries. So they're, food production there, kind of tucked in amongst all of these perennials. And back here, I believe these are apple trees. They look like apple trees that you've got planted here. And then underneath them, you have flowers. So again, you've got this food kind of mixed in with it. So where, you don't even really see it. It just looks like pretty landscape. And then also, like I said, like layering. So if you've got, a big tree, plant a shrub underneath it. And that shrub could be a fruit producing shrub, like a currant or a gooseberry that can take some shade, or it could be, an ornamental shrub. And then, sorry, messed up here. And then you can do ground covers kind of under and around everything. And those ground covers can be, kind of like creeping ground covers, like vines or stuff like that. But it could also be more like kind of perennials, things that aren't really ground covers, but like hostas, which, are really common, ornamentals, but they're actually also edible. They're grown as a crop in Japan, and they're pretty good, especially the really giant leaf ones are really good. When the shoots are first coming up in the spring, you can cut off those shoots and like kind of saute them in some butter and some salt and pepper. Very good. And there's no reason, not to stick those under fruit trees too. They don't need to just be under, maples. They can also be under an apple. And do, ground covers everywhere. It doesn't have to just be ornamental ground covers. It can be edible ones, which we'll go through a list of some of the good ones for that. And then, if you have vines, whether they're, ornamental vines, flowering vines, or fruit producing vines, like maypop or grapes, you don't need to just make like a standard trellis for it. If you want to integrate it into your yard a little bit more, have them grow over your pergola or over your arbor or along your fence. You can fit them in just like you would. And yeah, mix edibles with ornamentals. So when shouldn't they be mixed? We touched on this in terms of soil contamination. If your soil is contaminated, you really probably don't want to mix them, simply because you want to make sure you have that uncontaminated soil. And generally the best way to do that is a raised bed situation. But beyond that, the other time that you might not want to be mixing your stuff is if you want to be like really intensive about your vegetable production. Like if you're like, I want to grow a lot, like especially if you're talking about like staple type foods, like if you're wanting to grow, a lot of potatoes to store over winter, or a lot of sweet potatoes to store over winter, or lots of pumpkins or squash or things that you're going to be storing for a long time to eat large amounts of. To do things like that, you probably are going to want a designated garden area, because that's by far the easiest way to grow large amounts in a small space. But for things like lettuce or spinach or arugula, where you're not eating 50 pounds of it, it's easy to kind of sprinkle those in amongst things. And that's really what we're talking about. If you're big into growing potatoes, it probably doesn't make sense to plant one potato under this apple tree and one potato over there. If you want to grow a lot, you probably want a full bed of potatoes. It's definitely the way to go. But so then once you're kind of planned your site, figure it out, where the big trees will fit, kind of what trees you want. The other things that's important and can kind of help guide that is to building kind of that happy orchard, or healthy garden, is you want a happy, healthy plant. And you do that by picking a good site, which is why we went through and we figured out, what areas are pooling water, what areas are shady, and we're gonna, pick plants that fit that, because there are plants that like shade, there's plants that don't like shade, there's plants that like wet soils, there's plants that don't. And so we're gonna pick those to go in those appropriate spots, and then we're gonna plant the plant well. We don't want to just dig a real quick hole, throw it in, and don't even cover all the roots or something. You want to make sure that you dig a nice wide hole for it. It doesn't need to be very deep, but a nice wide hole is good. That helps break up compaction that you might be having. You want to make sure that you're planting the plant at the same depth as it was in the pot. So you don't want to be burying the stem of the plant for the most part. Some things like tomatoes are fine with that, but for the most part, you don't want to be doing that. You also don't want root hanging out the top. You don't want to be planting it too shallow. You want to be, right about the same depth. When you're talking about especially trees, shrubs, woody things like that, you want to make sure that you're backfilling with the original soil. You don't need to amend the hole itself. For things like vegetables, go ahead and amend the hole. They're only there for a year, it's fine. But for the kind of perennial things, especially, backfilling it with the original soil helps to encourage those roots to go out and produce nice, deep roots that are going to go in search of nutrients on their own instead of just hanging out in that really nice, rich hole that you created for it. For trees, especially if they're pretty tall when you stick them in, you're probably going to want to stake them just to make sure they're not going to flop over. If you're planting really small trees, probably not a big deal because the wind isn't going to be a big factor on those little trees, but it's always good to do that. For your trees, it's also good to protect the trunks in the winter. So just doing a wrap, you can buy little plastic spring wraps or plastic drain tile or something, or even just chicken wire, something to kind of put around the base of the trunk over the winter. And that is to prevent rabbits and voles from eating the bark, which they like to do, especially of fruit trees, because fruit tree bark is really high in sugars. And so when they're desperate for food, fruit trees are a really good snack in the middle of winter. But if they do that, they're probably going to kill your tree, which is not fun for you. It's also, again, for your woody plants in particular, you want a good carbon-rich mulch. And generally what that means is wood chips. You can also do things like straw or chopped up leaves if you have a bunch of those. But wood chips are usually pretty easy to come by. They're definitely the longest lasting of those options. But if you have a bunch of leaves from an oak tree in your front yard or a maple tree or something, and you want to chop them up in a lawnmower or rake them up and throw them around your trees, that's also great. That's the original mulch for trees, is their own leaves. And so it's a good thing to put around your fruit trees, to put around your planting areas. And they're really good for just about any plants. Wood chips aren't as nice around your vegetables because it's a pain to then dig up to plant more vegetables. If you're doing a vegetable bed, but around any especially permanent plantings, that good carbon-rich mulch is good. It helps retain moisture. It helps moderate soil temperature swings so that in the day, the soil's not getting really hot and then cooling off a bunch at night. Helps kind of lower those peaks and valleys in temperature. It also does some interesting soil biology things. It helps increase beneficial fungi in the soil, which is good for almost all plants, really, given the quality of most of our soils, but especially for your trees and shrubs. And so then soil improvement, getting to that point, is also important to having a healthy yard and orchard and garden. And really the key to that is soil life. It is, and not just worms, not just the life that you can see, but the micro life, your bacteria, your fungi, your microarthropods, your nematodes, your protozoa, your, all these different microorganisms that live in your soil, that are living out a whole food chain that you can't even see. And that food chain that's going on in there is actually really the ultimate source of your plant's fertility. They're the things breaking down the minerals in the soil, because your soil, like sand, silt, and clay, are literally just rocks. They're just different sizes and shapes of rock that are just really fine. So they look different than big boulders that we see. But if you look at them under a microscope, they look like rocks, because that's what they are. They're just really tiny rocks. And those rocks need to be broken down. They need to be made plant soluble. And plants can release some acids, but for the most part, those acids that are being used to break down those minerals are from the bacteria, the fungi that are eating those minerals. And they're, consuming those minerals, breaking them down, and then they're being released and made available to the plant by the predators like the microarthropods, the nematodes, the protozoa that are eating those bacteria and fungi, and then pooping out the nutrients that then the plant can use. And so if your soil is sterile, you're not going to be able to grow much unless you want to dump fertilizer on a regular basis. And they're also, believe it or not, the source of a lot of soil quality. So when you feel a nice crumbly soil, like if you go out into like an old growth forest and you reach into the soil, it's usually pretty easy actually to dig in just with your fingers, and it's like crumbly and spongy. It's almost kind of like a cake. Whereas if you try and dig in most people's yards, you need a shovel. Like you can't do it with your hands, and if you do it, it's like either really clayey or clumpy or really like just like dust. Like we'll just like break apart if it's dry. What makes that nice structure in those healthy ecosystems are the bacteria and the fungi. It's the glues that they produce that make aggregates that pull soil particles together. And that also creating that structure is what allows water to flow through. If it's just a bunch of really powdery, clay, it takes a long time for water to infiltrate and to get to your roots. And so your soil life is really what you're trying to do. So the ways of improving soil are really just ways to increase soil life. And soil life needs three things to survive long term, like unless you want to keep adding the soil life, which you could do. But if you want them to survive on their own so that you don't have to keep adding them, they need three things. They need food, which seems self-explanatory, but the food can come from two different sources. It can either come from actively growing plant roots, or it can come from organic matter in the soil, which is dead plants. And generally the number that they found is that you need about 3% organic matter in your soil if there's not actively growing plant roots for microorganisms to survive long term. I don't think I've ever seen a yard soil that had 3% organic matter because yard soils have generally been bulldozed at least once. The topsoil scraped off and sold to somebody and just left with subsoil, and then it's just planted with the grass that we only let get a couple inches tall. There's not much organic matter in most soil. And so that's why also, intermixing your perennials and your annuals can help, because your perennials are going to be actively growing roots, even if the annuals aren't there. And then having organic matter, increasing that in some way is going to help keep that soil life alive whenever in the winter, especially when you don't have perennials or annuals really growing. And in addition to food, it also needs oxygen. They need oxygen, at least the ones we want. Disease-causing organisms don't want oxygen. So if you want lots of disease-causing organisms in your soil, I guess try and avoid oxygen. And the things that deplete oxygen in the soil is standing water, which is why a lot of plants don't like areas that have standing water, is because they can't handle those disease-causing organisms. And you also want to minimize compaction. Compaction also minimizes the amount of oxygen in the soil. So standing water and compaction are really going to limit your oxygen. And then the third thing, which is even more obvious than food and oxygen, is that they need to actually be there. You need to have the life there to be able to sustain it. They can't just magically appear. And so if you have compaction, which most people do, there's a couple ways to break up that compaction in your yard or in your garden. Probably the best way from a soil life standpoint is a broad fork, and it looks like a digging fork or a pitchfork that it's just like on steroids, just a really big heavy duty one. And this is a picture of one. These tines are really long, and you just stick it into the ground and then you pull it back like to a 45-degree angle, and it'll pop the soil up, like it'll crack it, but it won't turn it. And so if you have worms and fungus and stuff like that in it, you're not pulverizing them, which is what happens when you run a tiller. But if a tiller is what you need, if your soil is really compacted and you need to till it once to break up that compaction, making sure that you're doing these other things so that you don't have to keep tilling it because there's no life to keep it nice and fluffy, then use a tiller if that's what you got. You can also break up compaction if you have a little more time or you're willing to put more time into it with cover crops. And different cover crops are better at this than others. Things like buckwheat, not very great at breaking up compaction. I mean, better than nothing, but not super effective. But there's things like tillage radish, which is a picture. I don't know why it looks like that. Makes it look like it's enormous. They are really big, but they stick up out of the soil, usually, up to like 6 inches or so. but they're essentially daikon radishes. I mean, they can go a foot down into the ground, basically drilling a hole. And then when they die and they rot, there's a big hole there. They're letting lots of oxygen down, breaking up compaction. And they grow best in cool seasons. There's also things like sorghum and Sudan grass, which are just incredibly tall, vigorous grasses, but that can produce really deep roots that help break up compaction. So that's another way to do it. Broad forking cover crops, generally better and more longer lasting than a tiller, but you can do a tiller if you have to. You also want to add organic matter, because again, almost no soil in people's yards is high enough in organic matter to be sustainable long-term from a soil quality standpoint. And generally the fastest way to do that is compost, because compost is just straight organic matter. So if you're able to come in and over your planting areas, break up the compaction, and then as soon as possible be spreading some compost on top, several inches over all of the planting area that you're wanting to do is really going to be the best. But compost can be expensive. It can be a lot of work to move. You can also do this with cover crops, just like breaking up the compaction. And there's ones you can look up which ones produce the most biomass, are going to be adding the most carbon to your soil. And those are also living roots, which are great. And you also want to feed good fungus specifically. And for perennials, especially woody perennials, like I said, this means adding wood chip on top of the compost. Wood can only be broken down by fungus. Bacteria can't break it down. And so if you have lots of bacteria in your soil, not a lot of fungus, if you put food that only fungus can eat, it's going to increase the amount of fungus because they're not having to compete with bacteria for that food. And then introducing the soil life. And the way to do that is really to be adding high quality compost teas or extracts. So that's generally compost that you make yourself or someone is making themselves. It's not the big industrial compost that you can get from cities or places like St. Louis Composting. They make great compost for adding organic matter. We use their compost all the time. But if you're looking to add the most soil life, it's good to be adding those large amounts of compost from the city, from St. Louis Composting, from other places like that. And then, the small you're making at home, from your own food scraps, taking that and sprinkling it really lightly over your planting area, or, soaking it in water for a couple hours, and then sprinkling that water over your area. That's the best way to do that. So maintenance, if there's no significant rain, you want to be watering your perennials at least once a week. One deep watering is better than a lot of small waterings. After the first year, you don't need to be watering your things like trees, shrubs, woody things every week. It's more like if we have a prolonged drought that's several weeks long, really hot, then you want to be watering them more consistently. You want to be renewing your wood chip mulch as it decomposes, and you want to be weeding your plants just like any other landscaping. So what to grow? This is where we're going to run over them real quick because I'm running out of time here. There are many different options that you can focus on. And again, I'm really just going to be talking about food. I'm not going to be talking about the hundreds and hundreds of non-food producing things that you can grow. And the ones that I'm going to be focusing on are things that are climatically adapted to St. Louis, are relatively disease resistant, or at least have varieties that are disease resistant, and have controllable pests through organic means. So things that you're not going to be having to do absurd amounts of work to control pests. And this is a handout that we'll send out later that has all the varieties listed. So I'm just going to run over basically the different species. So when you're talking about real big trees, if you want a big shade tree in your area, in your yard, some of the best ones are chestnuts. And this is a picture of a chestnut in bloom. Beautiful, even just as an ornamental, even if you don't want to get chestnuts from them. Pecans and hickories, which pecans are actually a type of hickory, but there's other types of hickories out there. Are great shade trees. If you want a giant tree, that's your way to go. You can also do black walnuts, which some people hate, but the nut is very good and it grows wonderfully here. For things like small trees, we've got a lot of the kind of standard fruit that people know. So things like apples, European pears, which are kind of the classic kind of pear shape. That's the European pear. There's also Asian pears, which if you haven't had one, you're missing out. Go get one. They're very expensive at the store though, which is why if you like them, you should grow They are closely related to apples and European pears, but they're the easiest of the three to grow. And they produce a fruit that looks a lot like an apple. It's got kind of that classic apple shape, but the color is more of like kind of a tan, kind of almost golden color. And it has a nice crunch like an apple, but it tastes more like a pear. It's very good if you haven't had one. You can also grow things like peaches. Peaches are probably the hardest to grow thing that I'm going to recommend. And the main reason we say it here is just because people grow them whether we tell them to or not. Peaches are the thing that are the most work to grow, really, of any fruit that you can grow here. They require a lot of pruning. They have a lot of pests and diseases. They are manageable by organic means, which is why they are on the list. But they have a lot of them, like a lot more than really anything else we're gonna run through here. There's also, I'm gonna jump down here. Apricots are similar to peaches, although they have fewer pests and diseases. The big caveat with apricots is that most of them bloom too early here. And so you almost never get fruit unless we have a year that was just a very, very mild winter. And there weren't any late frosts. So if you're going to do an apricot, you want to make sure to pick one that has a very late bloom. And even then, you might be needing to do some organic sprays that will protect the blooms when a late frost comes. So just to be aware that that's another one that's a little kind of on the edge of whether it's easy or not. There's also pawpaws, which is probably the most commonly and widely known kind of native fruit, which are delicious, great to grow, have virtually no pests or diseases, have a really cool kind of tropical look to them, which is always nice. But they do take a little bit longer to produce fruit, and pollination can be a little tricky. So sometimes you'll need to hand pollinate them to get a large number of fruit, but otherwise very easy and nice to grow. Jujubes, which is one that most people haven't heard of, but this is a picture of one here. It's a crazy looking tree that has these really kind of almost glossy, shiny kind of green leaves that grow on them, and it produces these red fruit to them. They come in different shapes. Some of them are more round, some of them are kind of classic pear shape, and they have a nice crunch to them like an apple. They're relatively bland, but very sweet, and so they're also used traditionally as dates. So you can dry them and kind of use them the same way that you would use a date. And like I said, very easy to grow, no pests or diseases, need very minimal pruning. Almonds are actually also an option here, believe it or not. We have one variety that we recommend that's on the list that we'll send out that grows here, has absolutely gorgeous blooms in the spring, just gets covered in kind of pink blooms that grow for it. And then serviceberry, which is the plant that I like so much. I put it on 2 slides here. There's kind of tree-ish size serviceberries, which is what you see here. Gorgeous blooms in the spring. They get a fruit on it that can be used very similarly to blueberries. They don't taste exactly like blueberries. You're not going to like be confused as to what you're eating or anything, but used in very similar ways, same size, same color, same texture to them. And they're also native, so very easy to grow, very minimal pests and disease problems, and really also don't need any pruning. For shrubs, there's lots of crazy ones that you can do. Bush cherry is one of our favorite, and there's lots of different type of bush cherries out there. If you look up bush cherries, our favorite are what are called the Romance series. It's a bunch that were just given really cheesy romance names to them. There's Romeo, and there's Juliet, and there's Crimson Passion, and there's Cupid, and like all these different ones. The one that we found kind of the most reliable, or that we've planted the most, is one called Carmine Jewel, which is in that same series but doesn't have one of those names like that, which is strange. And this is a picture of it growing here. It has little cherries on them, but we like them even more than the tree cherries because they have fewer disease issues, and Japanese beetles don't like them, and Japanese beetles absolutely love tree cherries for some reason, but they don't touch the bush cherries, but they're very delicious. Like I said, serviceberry again. There's also shrub form serviceberries. So just if you're looking for more of a shrub, also consider serviceberry. Oh, and I put it on here twice in a row. I guess I like it more than I thought. There's also the rugosa rose. So that's, I mean, if you like roses, but you also want some food, all roses are technically edible. So after the flower, if you've grown roses before, you know they produce a little red kind of fruit that's called a rose hip. The rugosa rose has the largest hip. This is a picture of somebody holding one, so you can see they're pretty big. And rose hips are edible. They're incredibly high in vitamin C. And so they've been used to make jams and syrups and stuff traditionally in the winter for people to avoid scurvy, which is not really an issue in the modern day United States, but in the past it was an issue. There's also the ribes fruits. So these are things like currants and gooseberries, and then hybrids of currants and gooseberries are called josta berries. So these are unique in that they are really the only fruit that actually likes shade, specifically afternoon shade here in St. Louis. They still will produce more if they get sun. You can put them in full shade and they'll produce some fruit, which is, I mean, really no other fruit tree or fruit plant will do that. But if you want, a decent amount of fruit, it's really best in St. Louis to have morning sun and then afternoon shade to protect them from that real intense heat that we get in the afternoons here in the summer. You can plant them in full sun, but generally what happens is once we start getting into July or August and it starts getting really hot, a lot of times they'll look like they're dying. They're not, but a lot of times the leaves will start shriveling up and they'll fall off, and the leaves it'll look like the plant is dead, but it's basically just gone dormant early because it just can't take that full direct sun. You can also grow hazelnuts here. A lot of times people think of hazelnuts as trees, and the commercial hazelnuts are usually pruned into a tree shape. But the hazelnuts that we grow here are hybrids of the native and the European one, which grow as shrubs. So that's another nice one you can fit in. There's also the cornelian cherry, which is actually a type of dogwood, believe it or not. And because of that, it has no pests or diseases. It's a large shrub, kind of small tree, large shrub kind of area. So this is a picture of one. And you can see these are very early spring. You can see nothing else is green here. Nothing else has leaves on it. It gets coated in yellow, little itty bitty yellow blooms. And then it produces little oblong fruit about yay big that are red and taste like a tart cherry. So are good for pies and juices and stuff like that. There's also the aronia berry, which is another one that really you should only grow if you're really interested in natives or medicinal type stuff. They taste terrible, but are incredibly nutritious and have a good flavor if you mix them with other things that are very sweet. So if you do like 1 part aronia berry juice with like 4 parts apple juice, it tastes like aronia, but it's sweet like apple, at which point it's really good, but eating a straight aronia berry is not a pleasant experience. There's also honeyberries, which are another one that's good to do where you get some afternoon shade. They don't like the shade, but they don't like our heat. And so giving them that afternoon shade keeps them a little cooler. And this is one that produces a little itty bitty blue fruit that tastes kind of like a blueberry, but produces fruit at the same time that strawberries are producing. So very early in the year. And then figs. Believe it or not, you can grow figs here. They usually grow as more of a shrub here because a lot of times the top will die, but the roots, they'll just send shoots back up and still be able to produce fruit every year. So you grow them almost kind of like a hydrangea or something where it kind of dies down to the ground a lot of the times. And this is just a picture of a fig with some leaves. They have very kind of nice Mediterranean look to them. We're getting close to the end here. Bear with me. I know we're running over a bit. For vines, if you have areas where you're wanting to grow vines, along a fence or, up over, an arbor, or up over, maybe if you've got like a chicken coop or a chicken run, you can grow some vines over it to kind of make it look a little prettier or to give some shade to your chickens. You can grow things like grapes. Really the only grapes that we recommend are ones that have seeds. Seedless grapes, for the most part, just have very little tolerance to fungal diseases. And if you haven't noticed, it's very humid here in the summer. And so we have perfect conditions for fungal diseases. And so unless you're wanting to be spraying your grapes with fungicides a lot, like as in 20 times a year, which is what commercial growers have to do some years, you probably want to stick with the seeded grapes. And we have specific varieties that we recommend that's on that list. You can also grow kiwis, again, believe it or not, but not the same kiwis that you see from the grocery store. So this is a picture, back here of the kiwis from the grocery store, the big fuzzy ones. So the ones that we can grow here called hardy kiwis are much smaller. So you can see they're more about grape size, and they don't have the fuzzy skin. So you can actually eat the whole thing. I mean, you can eat the fuzzy skin of the kiwi too, but most people don't enjoy that. But it's not fuzzy, so it's easy to just kind of pop the whole thing like a grape and eat it. And we actually teach a whole class just on grape and hardy kiwi. I think it's actually filmed and up on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and learn more about those. You can also grow maypop, which is actually a native passion fruit. So it's a beautiful ornamental. I mean, these are the flowers here off to the right, these purple and white and yellow and pink and just all these different colors to them. And they produce these weird looking fruit that once they start shriveling up, like it looks like they're starting to go bad, you rip it open, they've got these little, the black is the seed, and then these little sacs of juice around them, kind of like a pomegranate, and it's passion fruit. And you can kind of juice them and get some passion fruit juice. Very tasty, and if you decide you don't like it, it's still a beautiful ornamental native, and native pollinators adore these flowers, and so it's a good one to have around. You can also grow things like hops up fences, which are classically used for beer, but are also used to some extent medicinally. You can also eat the shoots when they're coming up as a vegetable, but generally, if you're not going to be brewing beer, it's just an ornamental. There's also annuals that fit in the vine category that you can use to kind of grow up and over things, or as like kind of ground covers, things like squash, melons, gourds, loofah gourds, pole beans, so the big long vining beans, and then Malabar spinach, which is one that some people haven't heard of, which is a picture here. This is the red version, so it has nice pretty red stems on it. It'll twine up fencing or trellising that you give it, and the leaves here are what are edible. It's a nice green, fresh or cooked, and it loves the heat of summer. So it's a good thing. Once your spinach is done in the spring, plant some Malabar spinach and eat that in the summer, and then once it's done, plant some fall spinach. Ground covers. Thinking about kind of edible ground covers that you can do. Things like strawberries are great. So this is a picture of kind of strawberries growing as a ground cover. So this is where kind of thinking about your priorities comes in. So the strawberries growing like this, where they're like really dense as a ground cover, you're not going to get a huge number of strawberries. But if you need a ground cover anyways, a couple strawberries is better than nothing if you're growing something that doesn't produce fruit. But if you were wanting to grow these primarily for fruit, or you wanted more fruit, you would be wanting to thin these out so that they have more space per plant. There's also lots of great herbs that can be good ground covers, things like mint, and there are dozens of different types of mint, from really short to really tall. Some are fuzzy, some are light green, dark green, all over the place, lots of different flavors, and they're indestructible. They'll take over an area, so don't put them in an area where you really do want a ground cover. I spelled thyme wrong, but thyme, and there's lots of different types of thyme, lots of different bloom colors on them, different flavors. Oregano also makes a good ground cover. And for annuals, there's also things like sweet potatoes make good ground covers. And then again, squash, melons, gourds, and loofahs also make good ground covers in areas. And then if you have kind of more like unusual or more kind of niche areas, a couple to kind of draw to your attention. If you have really rocky areas, prickly pear cactus are good ones to grow. There's actually a native prickly pear cactus, which is really pretty and is great just as an ornamental. This is one blooming. The blooms aren't open. The blooms are really pretty on the inside, but they get these flowers on them in the spring that bumblebees, again, absolutely love. You can also technically eat the pads. On the native one, it's hard to do because the pads aren't very thick, but if you want to try, you can. I've done it before. It's just a lot of work. But it is technically an edible. It's a native. It's pretty. If you like ornamental grasses, if you like the look of ornamental grasses, you can grow lemongrass. It's an annual here, but by midsummer into fall, I mean, it's big. That's what this picture back here is. These are lemongrass plants kind of sticking out, so they create that nice, kind of ornamental grass look to you, and it's a great herb. Man, I spelled a lot of stuff wrong. For fall blooming crocus, if you like crocuses, there's saffron, not saffron. And this is a picture of some saffron blooming here. They have these gorgeous purple blooms to them. and it's these little reddy orange things that stick out. That's the saffron. So I mean, you gotta grow a lot to get a decent amount of saffron. But if you like crocuses anyways, might as well grow some that you can also get some saffron from. And then if you have mulched areas, if you're doing that woody mulch, which hopefully you are doing, or if you're doing it for pads, you can also grow edible mushrooms. So King Strophoria is one that's really easy to grow in wood chips, and that's what this is here. It's where you can buy spawn of King Strophoria online, and you just sprinkle it in and water it in, and usually it'll just start growing within a year. You'll have all these mushrooms that'll pop up, pop them off, eat them, and they're really good. I really like King Strophoria. And then for annuals, again, sorry, there's only like two more slides here. For annuals, you can really do all veggies. Really, any veggie will work. That's like on a list for St. Louis, and we'll send out our planting calendar, which has kind of a full listing of all the vegetables that we usually recommend. And really, all veggies will do good. Pretty much all of them can be intermixed with other things. There's not really a reason why you can't intermix any of them. Again, unless you're thinking about like soil contamination or potential pet contamination, or you're really wanting to grow a lot or really intensively kind of things. Generally speaking, though, greens and herbs are the easiest to integrate. They're more tolerant of shade, so it's a lot easier to plant them amongst shrubs and trees and things where they're going to be getting kind of more dappled sun. Root crops are also kind of next in line that are relatively easy because they can also take some shade, although not as much shade as things like greens and herbs. Your fruiting crops are harder to do. If you're wanting to grow things like tomatoes or cucumbers or zucchini or peppers or eggplants, those things need, if you want good production, you really want to make sure you're getting that minimum of kind of 6 to 8 hours of sun, really, like full direct sun. And so those are a little harder to integrate. Those are a little better to do, maybe on the edge of your planting areas, or to have a bed that is more just full sun. And in terms of just being pretty, if you're looking to kind of mix into your ornamentals, some of my favorites are kale, chard, nasturtium, and sweet potatoes. And so layout again, I know I had this exact same slide earlier, but just to kind of recap here, we want to integrate and not segregate different types of plants. Mix your veggies, your fruits, your herbs, your ornamentals, your natives, put them all together, as long as you can identify them. And then mix your annuals in with perennials. Plant shrubs under larger trees, or kind of on the edge, maybe half under a tree. Do ground covers under and around your trees and shrubs. Have vines that grow up structures instead of just a standalone trellis. You can kind of integrate them into your landscape, save yourself some space. And yeah, edibles and ornamentals together again. So grow something beautiful and delicious that you enjoy. Make your yard something that you enjoy, that's nice and rejuvenating to be in, and not just stressful. So yeah, so that concludes it. Hopefully that was helpful, but again, I'm happy to answer any questions if we got them, or if you think of any, put them in the Q&A here.
So we did have a question about soil testing. So I put the link to that information in the chat. We are a drop-off site, which is listed on that page, but I do want to just let everyone know that just call ahead of time, because we're kind of sporadically in the office right now because of COVID. But we are a drop-off site for soil testing. Another person asked, do you know the scientific name of jujube? Or is it a specific jujube that you...
I would have to look it up to be sure, but I know the genus is Ziziphus, which I know just because it's fun to say, which is, I think, Ziziphas, Ziziphus. And then I think it's jujube. I think it's Ziziphus jujube, but I would have to double check that. But yeah, but I know it's Ziziphus, and I know there's a couple different types, but generally, if you're looking at like there's a couple different species, but if you're looking at like the cultivated variety of jujube, it's all the same one, and we list the varieties. Like Lee and Lang are two of the most common varieties here in the States, but yeah, it's Ziziphus something.
And then another person asked about getting the slides, and we do send these out to everyone, right?
Yes, I will be sharing this with another one of our staff members who sends that that email. So you will probably be receiving that tomorrow, would be my guess. And then we will also send the variety sheet that we had like a screenshot of earlier, and then our planting calendar as well.
Okay.
For vegetables.
It looks like that's all the questions.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. If you think of any more questions, feel free to email us. But otherwise, have a good rest of your night. And we are going to continue to have classes. They're just not going to be as regularly as they've been in the past. So if you have enjoyed our classes, keep a lookout for those. They're going to keep coming all winter long. So have a good day.